Broadcasting from the hills of East Tennessee, you're listening to Justified Radio, where each week we look at one of today's issues through the lens of God's Word. Justified Radio. It's where life meets the Bible.
This is Justified Radio, and today we have a special guest. We're joined by Ken Ammi, and Ken is a prolific writer and student of the things we've been talking about in the last little bit on Justified Radio concerning the sons of men, sons of God, daughters of men, the Nephilim, and giants in the Bible. So, Ken, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for taking on such a fascinating and hotly debated topic or set of topics.
Yeah, it is, and it's something that's what Phil and I have talked about and why we're so thankful to have you with us, because it is something I believe people need to discuss and try to get a handle on what is said there, because like we've said earlier, when you read through Genesis 6, nobody can read through that and not say, what's going on here? So we're looking forward to what we're going to hear.
Ken, how many books have you written, do you think?
I'm glad you said, do you think? Because I always joke that I should know my own canon, but I haven't counted lately. I think I'm maybe up to 50.
Oh, my goodness.
And then if I could memorize everything I've written, I'd be a genius, but that doesn't seem to be happening.
No. Well, I know, like I said, just in my experience, you're the most prolific writer. Now, I've looked. You do not write. Do you write fiction?
No. I have one book within which one single chapter is a fictional tale, but no. And thank God, good for those people who write fiction, because all that stuff about setting and character development and plot and mood, for me, it's just the facts, ma'am. Here's the information, and I'm done.
Yeah. Well, that's what I wanted to make sure I was saying that right, because there are other prolific writers who generate a lot of words concerning the subject, but for the most part, they're all fiction writers.
Yes. Now, yes. In fact, there's been an explosion of romance novels based on Nephilim tales.
Oh,
tons of them now.
Well, go ahead. I'm
now,
sorry.
One thing I've noticed is the people I term the pop researchers, who may not necessarily have any particular credentials, but they are very popular on these issues. It seems they inevitably end up writing works of fiction based on these issues. And my observation has been that it's a very easy transition for them, because what they're doing under the guise of theology is essentially already fictional. So it's not that much of a stretch to then just write a novel about it all.
When we talk about those who are doing serious research, theological research concerning the Nephilim and things like this, who would you consider to be some of the most authoritative that scholars, not just fictional writers, but who are some of the most authoritative scholars on the subject today?
Well, I did publish an entire book just about what scholarly academics have to say on these issues. And unfortunately, there are certain fundamental and yet basic level, I guess fundamental is basic, level errors that a lot of people tend to make, whether they're credentialed or not. And then that leads them into the same pitfalls, so that if you make certain fundamental level errors, then when you start attempting to connect dots, you're going to necessarily have to connect them with something tenuous. And then your conclusion can't really help but being faulty. So I'll give you an example. Anybody and everybody would instantly say Dr. Michael Heiser. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's an extremely recognized name, not only because he is definitely credentialed, no question about it, and experienced, no question about it, and he's a cool guy. You know, he's one of those scholars that has come down from their imitation ivory towers and it speaks to the public, and that's something that's very appreciated about him. And yet he too will tend to make certain key errors that then lead to some faulty conclusions.
Okay.
So ultimately, it's not as if somebody being credentialed makes them infallible, I guess, is the ultimate lesson.
Right. Well, now that's a good point, because that's one of the things that we want to do. Okay, we've talked a lot about Rudolph Bultmann, how he demythologized the Bible, or his attempt to. Well, I think he went too far. He's trying to rip everything supernatural out of the Bible. Now, there are some that we recognize go too far in the supernatural realm and start fancifying things up. That's where we want to talk to you and kind of share some ideas and thoughts, and just get some good, solid, because we know you've done the research, good, solid understanding of what these terms mean, who these people were, because we believe, as we know you believe, these were literal, real people who walked the face of the earth.
Right. So let's start at the beginning. Genesis, when we get to Genesis chapter 6, and we tread into this, where the Bible talks about the sons of God marrying or taking for themselves the daughters of man and having relations with them. Who are the sons of God and the daughters of men?
So we could give a historical answer and then a more like a theological answer. The historical one would be that the original, the traditional, and the majority view amongst the earliest Jews and Christians alike, from the BC days till at least 500 AD, is what's known as the angel view. So that's just verifiable. I wrote a whole book just chronicling that fact. Now, why that is, it probably has a few different answers to it, but one would be that if, for example, my shortcut would be to go to Job 38:7, where the sons of God witnessed at the very least the creation of the earth. Now, we're not told that they are angels, malachim, but we are obviously, they are not human. We can certainly verify that much.
Yeah.
So then when we're reading Genesis 6, that would allow us to see if that interpretation of the term sons of God would fit. And then if we fast forward to Jude and 2 Peter 2, then they're both referring to a sin of angels. Jude can be said to be correlating it with the sexual sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Peter gives essentially a chronology that would put it comfortably to pre-flood days. And the thing is, if Genesis 6 is not recording the fall of angels or the sin of angels, then pray tell, where is it? Because there's nowhere else in the Bible is there a sin of angels like this. So it's either this or nobody would really know what Jude and Peter were talking about. So that's kind of a few different ways of helping to understand what was going on in what I term the Genesis 6 affair.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, and you're very careful about the term angels. Angels is pretty generic for, I guess, any what we would consider a supernatural being that's not God. Your views on angels themselves, or the different levels of angels, do we divide them up as angels? Are there watchers that are comparable to what we would archangels in the Bible?
So the term angel is a very specific job term, got job title, a job function, and a category. So within that category, we're specifically told of an archangel. Maybe there's more than one, but Michael is specifically named. And then there would be, regular grunt angels.
Worker angels. Yeah.
Worker angels. But that would be the only two that we know of for certain. Then the issue is that when we get into discussing cherubim and seraphim, for some strange reason, people like to categorize them as angels or different kinds of angels or angelic, but there's no such thing in the Bible as that. And in short, they're different categories of being, because angel, cherub, seraph, they're different job titles, different job functions, and they all look different from one another. So those are different categories altogether. So for instance, the generic job of an angel is to deliver messages for God. So if cherubim and seraphim don't do that, and we never see them doing that, then by definition, they're not angels. So it'd be like saying bovines and humans are the same kind of being because we both share the earth. But I mean, it's just not good taxonomy. They're different categories of any way you look at it. Now, then we do get mentions of things such as principalities and powers, right? Where you get these terms like arche and cosmocrator, in the Greek. And sometimes that is stated about what do appear to be what would in scholarly literature be called God's divine counsel. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it seems to be talking about the demonic realm, because we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against, and then you have these terms, right? The thing is, it's really hard to know who's fitting where, because we're not told exactly who is categorized in each one of those levels, or even how they reckon things. So for instance, are there angels or any kind of divine counsel being who watch over entire nations, and then maybe states, and then cities, neighborhoods, families? Do they even think about it the way that we do? And then what happens if borders change or a new country is established? I mean, who knows how they're handling it, but it does appear that there's hierarchies. We just don't know who exactly is in which one.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Kim, because that's one of the things that I have held on to for quite a number of years now. And reading through Daniel was really what got me to that understanding, at least in my mind and heart, that there are angels behind, and I'll just say it the best way I can understand it, behind the political systems of the world. I believe, based on the Bible, that Michael is the angel behind the political system that should be true today in Israel, and he guards Israel. I believe that the rest of the nations of the world have demons trying to manipulate their political systems to draw us away from God. And to be honest, I'm seeing that in the United States on a level now that I have never seen before. The political structure, it seems to be doing everything possible to pull us away from believing in the true God of Israel, the only God who is.
Yes, I did want to, I recall that you asked about watchers. Watcher is really just an AKA for angel, which is an AKA within the context to sons of God. It's just that it's a Second Temple era manner in which to refer to angels. That's incidentally why it's found in the book of Daniel also, and the Aramaic portions, watchers. That's all it is. It's just another term for angel. Now, I did release a sample chapter from one of my books online. Anybody can find it, an article called The Apocalypse of the Hidden Hand. And it talks exactly about what you mentioned, which is the examples in the Bible that really do correlate with each other about what I call the spiritual sovereign behind the human sovereign. And that's incidentally why there are a couple of texts that are a little difficult, Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, where it's a lamentation against the human sovereign. But then all of a sudden you start recognizing, wait a minute, what's being said now doesn't apply to the human sovereign. So it's a correlation between the rise and fall of the human sovereign to the rise and fall of the spiritual sovereign behind them. Yes, that's fairly evident.
Right.
But exactly the two verses you spoke of, whenever I'm teaching through that and explaining that as best I can, I tell people that I believe that at that time, the prophet was speaking to the king, but he was looking over the king's shoulder and then began to speak to the principality, power, demon, however, angelos, whatever we want to call, behind that political system.
And because, for example, it's just as you said, it begins with, here's against the king, and then all of a sudden against the prince. Okay, well, it could be a human prince, but as you mentioned earlier, I believe you specified that Michael is referred to as the prince over Daniel's people.
Right.
So that there's a biblical support for interpreting it that way. And that for me is the best thing I could do is I don't have to make up stuff when I can find texts that really help me build an argument towards a conclusion that I find more biblical than a lot of the sci-fi stuff that we mentioned earlier.
Right. Well, and I don't want to, but there again, okay, we talk about that and how people have messed it up at times. Not that I've got it right and everybody's got it wrong, but I've talked to people about this particular sin that we see in Genesis 6, and then talked to them about in Jude and in 2 Peter. And then, and trying to get them to think through. And one of the things that so many people will say, they'll say, now, wait a minute, you go to Matthew and it says that, no, we'll be like the angels in heaven who are neither marrying or given in marriage. And at that point, I always say, we're not talking about marriage. We're talking about something that's against God's plan. Marriage is the natural union of a man and a woman that God designed for one man and one woman to come into relationship with to procreate others who are made in the image of God. It seems to me that what was going on there in Genesis 6 was some kind of perversion of that, trying to disrupt God's plan with Satan's plan.
Now, I like the fact that you referenced the Matthew 22 text accurately, because that is very rare in these discussions. In fact, my latest book on these issues is about what Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias have to say about it. And I ended up having to make a little comment about, look at all the things we were told about Matthew 22:30 and how much was poured into that one verse that it never says. Because even if you take it just, okay, look, it's talking about marriage. The thing is, as you specified, Jesus was talking about the angels of God in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the ones who did get married are considered sinners, having left their first estate, as Jude put it. So Jesus wasn't just speaking about all angels regardless. He was very specific. I'm talking about that the angels of God in heaven don't do this. The loyal ones.
Yeah.
He was very clear about that.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we agree, and I think we do, about the sons of God, that they are supernatural beings, angelic beings, if you will, fallen angels, the Nephilim that are mentioned in Genesis and that are also referred to in Numbers. What are the Nephilim? And do the translators, do they get it wrong when they render Nephilim as giants?
Okay, very important issues. In fact, I'm going to throw another issue on top of this one, which is that, okay, I'm hoping the train of thought will come back into the station. How did you begin that statement? It was about...
Well, about the Nephilim, talking about the Nephilim mentioned in Genesis chapter 6. Mentioned
no, there was
Numbers
something
30.
before that. I'm
Oh.
sorry. I hope I'm not ruining this.
No, we were talking about
This recording.
correctly the sons of God, being fallen angels or angelic beings or supernatural beings.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. I was just going to emphasize that it seems to me that Genesis 6 is recording the event of the fall or sin of angels. Okay, because there's a lot of speculation about how, well, angels fell in primordial days, right? Or on top of it, well, Satan fell in primordial days, and then the angels fell along with him. That is why by the time you get to Genesis 3, Satan's already fallen to the point that he's tempting Eve to sin. But it seems to me Genesis 3 is recording the action that Satan took that caused him to be fallen. And Genesis 6 is recording the fall of angels, because the only reason there is to think that they fell primordially is actually Revelation 12. And I don't know about the rest of Revelation, but chapter 12 to me is very much chronological, and it sets the fall of it sets the fall of angels to Oh, gentlemen, I apologize. I'm usually a little sharper than this, but honestly, I've been doing very physical work all day, and I'm a bit exhausted. Let me just take a second to look that up, because it is important just to iron out a couple things about Revelation 12, and I don't want to stick my foot in my mouth.
No, actually, I'm interested to hear what you think of Revelation 12.
Okay, here it is. Okay, so in Revelation 12, we have Satan casting the angels to the earth.
Right. A third.
Before Jesus is born. Okay, so you say, well, how far before that? And there's really no reason to go into primordial days when, again, you could very much see that if Satan is sinning in chapter 3 and the angels are sinning in chapter 6, there's no reason to claim that they were fallen way, way, way before that in time immemorial, because those are the actions that we're told that they took that are sinful. So why push that off to somewhere else when you can support the claim that that's when they sinned right there just by looking at the text?
Yeah. Can I interject something? And this is something that I'm thinking through and not really pushing the issue, but when I begin to think about God and the angels, I'm seeing God in a timeless domain. When I'm seeing the descriptions in the Bible that describe the world and the events of the world and humans like us, we see a timed realization. And I'm just kind of working through that, not trying to say anything other than just kind of working through that. Is it possible, and I'm not asking, I'm just saying as a thought, is it possible that God and the angels are in a timeless existence and we're in a timed existence? And that's how I kind of reconcile this. And it might be completely atheological to do that, but that's kind of how I see God, because we do know that God is timeless. He's eternal.
Right.
We're very temporal. So, and that's kind of how I think through some of these issues. Whether it's right or wrong, it does help me a little bit.
Yes, and it would seem that even though angels witnessed the creation of the earth, and who knows what else they witnessed before that even, but when they interact with us, it seems like they do have to engage our time stream, as it were, linear chronological time. Because that just seems to be the way that they function, is they come down from God to perform certain acts, such as delivering messages in time.
Yeah. Right. Well, and we know in Daniel specifically that there's a period of time from when God heard Daniel's prayer to 3 weeks later.
Yes.
So that he was able to respond to Daniel because of running into the prince of Persia.
So now the thing about, just to put a little bookend on the Revelation 12 thing, it's because when we read about the war between Michael and his angels and the dragon and his angels, that is set to post Jesus' ascension after that. Now, I know preterists would say it happened right around 70 AD. Dispensationalists would set it off into the future. That's a secondary issue to the fact that chronologically, that war in heaven did not take place in primordial days. That war in heaven is post the ascension of Jesus. So that's what's very, very important here, is that you can't say because there was a war in heaven, then it was in primordial days. This chapter won't allow for that.
Right.
Okay, so then running back to Genesis 6, yes, we have the sons of God who we're understanding as angels, mating and having offspring with human women. Now, one thing I find very, very important to understand is that sometimes we use the term spirit and spiritual as if they're the same thing, but they're not. So Jesus said a spirit has not flesh and bone. By definition, a spirit, and I'll emphasize in and of itself, a spirit has no body. So you can't talk about a spirit body because those are contradictory terms. One implies flesh and bone, the other one doesn't. And yet, that's a spirit in and of itself. But for instance, human beings are body, soul, and spirit. So a spirit can inhabit a body, but the spirit isn't the body. It's like maybe the animating force behind the body. Whereas spiritual, well, human beings can be spiritual, right? We could say angels are spiritual. Anything can be spiritual. Spiritual doesn't imply anything about physicality or lack thereof. So when we think about angels, it is very common to think that they are spirit beings, meaning disembodied, and then that they take on human bodies or appear human, but they're really not, or they morph like they shapeshift. But there's really nothing like that in the whole entire Bible. It just does not exist. The reason that it seems to me it is claimed generally that angels are spirit is really because of Psalm 104, verse 4, which then gets quoted in Hebrews 1, and then it's commented upon in Hebrews 1. So the issue is that, and it's really interesting to me, both in the Greek and the Hebrew, there are words that can mean either wind or breath or spirit, right? Ruach and pneuma. And so it is fascinating that that just happens to be in both languages. So then the question is, well, then how do you interpret it? Well, context is always king. The context will tell you. So for instance, and I'm just going to summarize it. Psalm 104, if you read it, it's constantly making reference to natural phenomena. So then when you get to the verse that says that God makes his angels ruach and his ministers a flame of fire, then you have to ask yourself, how am I going to interpret ruach? Well, because the psalm is constantly making reference to natural phenomena, it's forcing you to interpret winds, as many English Bibles actually have it. So he's making his angels, his messengers, winds. Why is that? Well, because that's like Jesus said in John 3, that the spirit comes and goes. You don't. It's like the wind. You don't see it, right? But you can discern its action. So angels are coming and going, and we might not necessarily see them. So they're like the wind. You don't see wind, but you see its effects. Right. So anyhow, then that's quoted in Hebrews 1. So then you're also forced to interpret that as winds because you're picking it up from the context that demands that. And then when it's commented upon, you also have to interpret it or translate it as winds because that's how you're consistent. That's so basically one single reference to angels being spirits in only some versions. 3 references collapse to one because they all come from Psalm 104. Up against what? Up against many, many times that the Bible describes angels as looking exactly like human males, ontologically, with no indication that they're actually not like that. But they only take that on that appearance. That's never stated, nothing like it whatsoever. And we see them doing very physical things. We see them eating. We see them walking. We see them taking physical actions. So why throw all that away because of one verse that could be translated more than one way, right? So why deny the preponderance to go for the minority of information? So all that to say that it seems to me God created physical beings. So for instance, angels are physical. Now, I think of them as being as physical as Jesus is post-resurrection, where he's physical enough to be standing in front of you. He can be touched. He can eat, but also with added capabilities we don't have currently that we won't have until we're glorified or resurrected, such as being visible or invisible, walking through a solid object, for instance. And this is why, incidentally, whenever an angel appears to, for instance, Samson's mother or Zacchaeus in the temple or Mary, the first thing the angel says is, "Fear not." It seems to me it's because they think they're alone and all of a sudden some guy's standing there.
Yeah.
Because they can just say, okay, I want to be visible now. I want to interact with the 3 spatial dimensions plus time. So here I am, and it's like shocking. And so that to me is very, very important. Now, it does seem to me that God created some actual spirits in and of themselves. But angels are not them. I think they are physical, but like again, with sort of what we would call glorified bodies. And so this makes perfect sense to plug it into Genesis 6, because how is it that angels can mate with women? Because they look exactly like human males. That's why. And on top of that, when later on, as the centuries go by, a view is popularized, which is known as the Sethite view, which is the sons of God are Sethites, the daughters of men are Cainites. And I always wondered why exclusively male Sethites? Why exclusively female Cainites? Why not as just intermixing of the both? Well, the angel view tells you why it's exclusively male sons of God, because all angels are described like human males. Yeah. So then who are they going to mate with? Well, it has to be exclusively human women. So that really helps us. Again, I didn't have to make anything up here. I just looking at what the Bible's telling us and applying it to itself to interpret itself, and it makes sense for us.
Right. That's one of our main points whenever we're trying to teach, Phil and I both, as well as you, that Scripture interprets Scripture often, if not always. And it's very important that you keep in that context of what the Scripture is talking about when it speaks of it.
And so now that actually gets us into an interesting area, because when we think about Nephilim, then yes, they were half angel, half human. Okay, and if you notice, Genesis tells us that they were in the earth in those days and also after that, and that they became mighty, which were men of old, men of renown. So exclusively looking at Genesis 6, we know essentially nothing about them except who their parents were, and that they became well known for who knows what, just for something. We don't know what. Okay, we can throw a lot of speculation and maybe pull in other extra biblical texts, but just isolating this text for a second, that's all we know. Now, before moving to Numbers 13, I did want to make a point about demonology, if I may. And now in one of my books on demonology, it took me like 30 pages, so I'll give you the Reader's Digest version, which is that when we recognize that angels are physical with their own type of flesh, with their own physicality. Now, Jude and Peter both tell us that the sinful angels were incarcerated, right?
Right.
So then we think about, okay, they were incarcerated. So then fallen angels can't be demons. So what are demons? Well, speculation, as I'm going to term it, from the Second Temple era, so pseudepigraphical texts, Jubilees and First Enoch, aka Ethiopic Enoch, tell us that demons are the spirits of dead Nephilim. Okay, I mean, I think that's not a bad guess, and it goes quite a ways, actually, to making sense of a lot of things, but I developed my own sort of mechanism as to how demons could be fallen angels, but with a very subtle way to understand the mechanism as to how that happens. So in my view, and I think it's biblically supported, unlike the pseudepigraphical texts, when the angels were incarcerated, they were incarcerated bodily, whereas their spirits roamed the earth, and that's demons.
Okay, I've never heard that.
Okay, you never heard it because I made it up.
Well, yeah.
And by the way, when I came up with this theory, I remember telling my pastor, I think I have a really understanding of what demons are. And it makes me nervous because I'm not the kind of guy to say, oh, I got a new thing. And so I've made a little niche for myself. And now I can start a whole ministry based on my little revelation. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I think this is what the Bible is telling us. It's just that it's not really been very well understood. So now if you think about it, why would demons want to possess people? Well, because they used to be incarnated themselves. They were embodied, and they seek that. They still want that. Why do they like themselves being worshipped as idols, as an embodied being? Because that's what they used to be, and they still desire that. And the icing on the cake is you'll find times where Jesus is interacting with demons. Maybe they're called evil, wicked, lying spirits. Okay, those terms are another issue. And you'll notice that they're terrified of what? They're terrified of being sent into the abyss, specifically. Well, Peter tells us that God incarcerated the fallen angels in Tartarus, which is a unique word, only once in the entire Bible. And I think Peter was homiletically speaking to his Greek audience, because they instantly would have understood, oh, Tartarus, that's like the lowest place in the abyss. And that's where the real bad dudes are, right? The hybrids in their mythology, right? The Titans and whoever else, the quote unquote gods. So I think they would have understood that. Well, that correlates to the abyss. And so why are demons terrified of that specifically? Not the lake of fire, the abyss.
Right.
Because if they're sent into the abyss, then they're going to re-inhabit their angel bodies, and then they'll be stuck down there doing hard time for, who knows, centuries or millennia. That they do not want that,
Yeah.
So I think there's certain things that clue us in on that, how that's what's going on. And so then, in my view, Revelation 9, when the abyss is opened, that's when the demon spirits would re-inhabit their angel bodies, and then they come out and they wreak havoc on the earth. Later on, they get into the heavenly war with Michael and the loyal angels, and they lose, and that's essentially the last we hear of them. So I think that what I'm saying is when we pull, the Bible tells us precious little about the paranormal realm, because the Bible is an anthropological book more than anything. It tells us about our human origins, the human fall, human redemption, human relationship with God. So when it touches upon anything else, it's very brief, and then it always brings the focus back to us. But when we take these little nuggets of information and we actually do systematically put them together, I think it paints a much clearer picture. So then the issue with the Nephilim is that they lived pre-flood. So by definition, we would have to conclude they didn't make it past the flood.
And
so the flood would have been the end of them.
And, to interrupt here, because if we look at this same chronology, these fallen angels, and the possibility of the fallen angels, they have bodies that they could procreate with human women. And we say, well, why don't we see that now? Why don't we see that past Genesis 6? Well, you mentioned because those angels, they're imprisoned right now. The reason we don't see it happening right now is because those angels are in Tartarus. That they can't do it now. They're not out roaming like they were then.
Right. And their spirits are, but their spirits in and of themselves disembodied, so they can't, even if they wanted to.
Right. And I agree with everything you all are saying, but I also think that angels might learn a little better than humans do. When they saw these that are cast into the abyss, the angels that maybe rebelled, that saw that happen, because of that, they said, oh, we're not doing that. Humans have a tendency to repeat our errors time and time again. Maybe angels don't.
Right. And as I noted, there's only a one-time fall of angels in the Bible. If Genesis 6 isn't it, I don't know what is. And now in Ezekiel 31, there's a very elaborate metaphor about a tree and its branches, and it's very symbolic, but it does seem to imply that when the loyal angels saw what happened to the sinful ones, they were like, oh no, we're not doing that.
Yeah.
Ain't doing that.
Make another plan. We're done with that. Yeah.
So even the term Nephilim, we only find it twice in the Bible. Once in Genesis 6, but we see it post-flood in Exodus. So how do we explain that?
Yes, in Numbers.
Or in Numbers, excuse me. I made the same mistake with David the other day. In Numbers 13, yes.
Okay, so yes, if you speak in very generic terms such as the Bible says, and I've heard it a million times. Well, in Numbers 13, the Bible says that there were Nephilim on the earth. So there you go. But okay, the issue is who said that? What was the reaction to what they said? And what came of it? We still have to interact with the narrative, which precious few people do with Numbers 13. So just to give you a very quick rundown, the key portions are, say, verse 20-ish to 33, where as the Exodus reaches the land of Canaan, spies are sent into the land. There's 12 of them. They spy out the land. They come back and they report on what they saw, right? The first thing they talk about is, hey, look at this fruit. Wow, fruit is great. The land is great. It's flowing with milk and honey. And then they talk about how the people of the land are strong and the cities are walled and very great. Okay. And then they mention every people group they saw. The Anakim, Amalekites, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Canaanites. And they specify where all of these people group lived, by the way. Okay, and then we're told that Caleb stilled or quieted the people. And he said, let us go up at once. We're able to possess it, for we are able to overcome it. Basically, get her done, right? That was so that tells you something was disturbing the people when they heard that report. And well, yeah, I mean, all of a sudden, remember, these are wilderness tent dwellers. They're itinerant. And now they're being told that they're about to confront strong people who live in big fortified cities. Okay, that's intimidating.
Yeah.
Of course, Caleb is like, what's that to us? We got God on our side. And then it says, but the men that went up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. So instantly there's this division. You have the 10 spies over here and Joshua, and then Caleb, and we end up realizing Joshua sided with him on the other side. So there's a division here. And now the 10 instantly, at the very least, are showing themselves to be unfaithful and disloyal, because God had commanded them to take the land, and they're saying, no, we're not going to be able to. So right there, that's a serious character flaw at the very least. Then the narrative specifically tells us they brought up an evil report of the land. Okay, so now we already had a report of the land. Then Caleb seems to counteract the negative reaction. Then these guys say, okay, we're not going to be able to do this. And then we're told of a second report. And here's what they say. The land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up its inhabitants. Well, hold on a minute. The original report spoke well of the land. These guys are contradicting that. They're saying, no, it eats up its inhabitants. So that's a serious problem right there. It's a contradiction. Then they say, all the people we saw in it are men of great stature. Well, hold on. That's an embellishment, because the original report stated that they were strong. And even though they themselves said they're stronger than we, all of a sudden you're throwing in that, oh, by the way, they're all of great stature. And also there's no indication that all of those people group were of great stature. We know generically that, for instance, Anakim were tall, but of course that's compared to the average Hebrew male of those days, who was 5 foot even, maybe 5'3". Okay, so the term tall or the term great stature is purely subjective, compared to, well, relating to whom you compare it, right? And then they say, there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, so the Anakim, which come from the Nephilim. And we were in our own sights as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Okay, so now they've made 4 claims about which the whole entire rest of the Bible knows nothing. That all the people were of great stature, that there's post-flood Nephilim, that Anakim are related to them, and that they're very, very, very tall. You won't find that anywhere else in the whole Bible, period, full stop. So now you have to ask yourself, okay, am I going to side with unfaithful, disloyal, contradictory, embellishing men who were set to present an evil report, wherein they made 4 claims about which the whole rest of the Bible knows nothing, and who contradict Moses, Caleb, Joshua, God, and the rest of the Bible, because all of them affirm that people such as Anakim were in the land, but none of them ever say a single word about Nephilim? Or am I going to side with Moses, Caleb, Joshua, God, and the rest of the Bible? I mean, that's really the decision you have to make. In other words, are you going to build an entire all-encompassing theory upon this one single verse, which is hermeneutically inappropriate or just commonsensically inappropriate? And that's just a few of the problems with this verse, by the way. On a common sense level, you notice the first thing they do when they return from spying out the land is, hey, check out this fruit. Really? They didn't say, OMG, you'll never believe what we saw. We saw the most awe-inspiring creatures on the whole planet. No, they're like, check out this fruit. It just doesn't make sense. And the fact that they embellish as they go along, for instance, we saw the Nephilim. Okay, where? They don't tell us. They were able to tell us where all the other people group lived. This is just kind of like, yeah, we saw them. Okay, I mean, there's so many, there's even textual problems with this. There's so many issues with it. But what happens so one thing we discussed before we started recording the other day actually was how we humans tend to take extreme views, right? The one or the other. Yeah. In this view of Genesis 6, of the angel view, it's either to deny there's anything paranormal about it, or to go off into what I term neo-theo sci-fi land, okay? And so now the neo-theo sci-fi is that, yes, we're gonna just pick up verse 13, verse 31, 33, we're gonna run with it. We're not gonna interact with the narrative as I just did. We're just gonna run with it, and we're gonna turn that into a worldview hermeneutic via which we then interpret other texts and pull them into this grand narrative, which is a grand narrative that biblically just doesn't exist. But let me just give you a little example of that. So if you recall in Genesis 6:4, it states that Nephilim were in the earth in those days and also after that. Oh, so now that I read all the way to Numbers 13, I'm going to go back to Genesis 6 and I'm going to insert that. Well, since they were around in Numbers 13 post-flood, therefore, after that means after the flood. But is that what Genesis 6 is telling us? Because that's verse 4. The flood is not even mentioned for the very first time until verse 17, a full 13 verses later. Besides which, verse 4 tells you exactly when it's talking about those days and after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bare children to them. So the question becomes, well, when was that? Well, verse 1 told us, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men were fair, and so on. So then the question becomes, well, when was that? I have no idea. I mean, it could have been as early as when Adam and Eve's children started having children. But regardless, it's telling us Nephilim were in the earth when that happened. And then after that happened, so that it kept happening, but it's all pre-flood. The flood brought an absolute end, and we're specifically told in the Old and New Testament that 8 people plus some animals survived. Right. So therefore, Nephilim did not survive, nor did they return, nor will they in any way, shape, or form. That's just, it doesn't exist biblically. Okay. And the only way to argue for it, again, is to pick up one verse and then use it as if you're going to interpret the entire rest of the Bible through it.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but if I say, okay, can I agree the Nephilim, they do not exist post-flood? The subject of giants, the sons of Anak, King Og of Bashan, Goliath and his brothers that are described, that not only are they described as being tall, and you can make the case that they're tall, but King Og, when it describes his bed, or what some think could be his coffin, 13 feet and a half, 13 and a half feet according to our measurements. Goliath's armor, his spearhead, his brother's spearhead. How do we explain those things?
So step one, in my mind, would be forget the vague, generic, subjective, and undefined latecomer English word giant. Because while in modern days, it generally does refer to somebody who's taller than average, why should we imagine that that's what it meant all those millennia ago in a different culture, in a different language? So a lot of people will argue for post-flood giants because the Old Testament's full of references to giants. But people who think that need to realize only in 2 of those occasions, as you mentioned earlier, is the word giant rendering, not even translating, rendering Nephilim. All the other times it's rendering Rephaim or Repha. Okay, so that has to be, even in English, you should recognize that due to the context, you can't have post-flood Nephilim or post-flood giants of the same sort that were produced by the sons of God and daughters of men. Because the flood builds a wall that's impenetrable. So then any giants afterwards, you would have to conclude there's something else.
Well, except for those who make the argument that the DNA in the wives or whatever, but the DNA is there, that you see them reintroduced into the population.
Yes, and the reason that claim is made, let me put it this way, the reason somebody invented that story is because they were reading Numbers 13:33, and they said, well, how did it, I know, I'm going to invent something unbiblical to explain how it came to be later on as well.
So I agree totally that when you're interpreting scripture, you have to interpret it based on the context of the time, that you can't go ahead and grab something and then bring it back in time and say, look here, I'm right.
But see, that's why people invent those stories. Or I know of people who say, well, more angels fell post-flood. Okay, but that's just another story somebody's inventing in order to support Numbers 13:33. I'm telling you, that's the mother of all Nephilim texts, the mother of all 2 of them. That's the one. Because if you get that one wrong, forget it. You're going to get everything else wrong. But why even bring up the issue of unusual height if the context is Nephilim?
Right. Well, that's something that I've wrestled around with in my mind. To be honest, I have known some very large people. Okay.
And David's not short himself, by the way. David's a tall man. So,
well, but thinking it through, the intimidation factor, seriously, you look across and you see these noticeably larger men, there would be some intimidation factor there. And everything you're saying, we agree, kind of. So, nobody's going to agree 100% on everything, but, I've thought a lot about these things, and I want to give a plausible answer to people. And I think you're doing that. And I really appreciate that.
So, by the way, I would not mind whatsoever hearing those things on which we disagree, but just to give the answer to what I asked is, remember, I emphasized in Genesis 6, we have no physical description of them whatsoever. We just know they were well known. They were mighty, period. Well, guess what? The thought that they were even 1 single inch taller than average comes from, guess what? Numbers 13:33. That's it. And so you have to conclude it's unreliable.
And listen, I agree with that. And I agree that you have to go to Numbers and see them described as being large, and then you go back and say, oh,
yes,
these were giants.
And the thing is, basically, Numbers 13:33, the bottom line for me is these guys were scared, and they concocted a don't go in the woods type of fear-mongering scare tactic of a tall tale. That's why they were saying what they were saying. Because all of a sudden, they're inventing this story they never mentioned before. Oh, no, we can't do it. This is why. And they kind of are upping the ante of their fear-mongering. Incidentally, that event right there was the reason God commanded the people to wander the wilderness for an additional 4 decades. That was the event that caused it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So now attached to this is a linguistics issue because, okay, if Nephilim if we have no reliable indication that they were unusually tall, especially so very, very, very tall, then why did translators end up referring to them as giants? Okay, that only begs the question of what does giant mean? Because I can think of 5 or 6 different definitions / usages. This happened because the Septuagint translators, right, aka the LXX, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, roughly 300 BC, they rendered, again, not translated, they rendered Nephilim as gigantes. Okay, now, one of the huge blunders they made, in my view, is they also rendered Giborim as gigantes. And they also rendered Rephaim as gigantes. And it's generally just a terrible idea to render 3 different words with just one word, because it just causes confusion. And you don't have to know ancient languages to recognize Nephil, Gibor, Rapha. They're such different words. There's no way you really should render them with just one word.
Yeah, that's
just a basic level issue. So that's why I'm saying it wasn't even a translation. It's a rendering. So now gigantes literally and only means earth-born. It implies nothing about height. But the thing is, the English word giant comes from the Greek word gigantes. And because in relatively modern days, giants is taken or used as implying unusual height, then we're reading back millennia and saying, oh, well, that must be what they were telling us back then. But there's just simply no indication of that. There's a few more complexities, but the bottom line is that this is the word concept fallacy. To say, for instance, if one of you is taller than the other, I could say, well, he's a giant. But you can't say, well, because he's called a giant, therefore his entire body length's taller than average. No, that's a word concept fallacy. You can't just take the word and turn it into a concept. You still have to understand what the word means. Okay. So then rendering Giborim as gigantes is fortunately something most English versions have absolutely dropped, because Giborim just means might or mighty.
Right.
And it's used of angels, it's used of David's soldiers, it's used of Boaz, it's even used of God in Isaiah 9, El Gibor, right? Okay, so that's simple. And then referring to Rephaim as gigantes, ergo giants, again, we're strictly talking about translations now. We can actually just dismiss all of that if we want to, if you want to stick with the Hebrew text. You can't even have that discussion, but okay, we're going with Greek and English. Even then, you can't say, because they're called gigantes or giants, ergo they were very, very, very tall. You can't do that because that's just not what the word meant.
Yeah,
it's that simple. So again, some Rephaim, and there were Rephaim subgroups, such as Anakim. They're a subgroup of Rephaim. Some of them are called tall. But again, what on earth does that mean? One of you is taller than the other. Big deal.
Right.
So now, there's only 2 specific heights told to us in the Bible, period. Okay, one is an Egyptian man who, when you do the calculations, it was 7'5". The other one is Goliath. And here we have a textual issue of sorts, okay? Now, the Greek version, the Septuagint, has him as being just shy of 7 feet. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have him as being just shy of 7 feet. And even Flavius Josephus has him as being just shy of 7 feet. But then the later Masoretic text have him being just shy of 10 feet. Okay, now, to me, height is it's a non-issue biblically, but whatever, let's go with it. look, if you're a Hebrew male average, you're 5'3". So a guy who's just shy of 7 feet, yeah, that'd be a big dude right there. Quite intimidating as well. And the emphasis on Goliath, by the way, is that he's an experienced and successful warrior.
Yeah.
That's really the problem. This is a big guy who is capable, right?
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about his armor, certainly impressive. Do recall, however, that he had an armor bearer with him helping him out with his equipment. And you can get yourself online any day of the week and look up strongman or weightlifting competitions. Well, you'll see guys that are right around 6 feet lifting 1,000 pounds. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to be very tall to be extremely strong. And also, one of David's fighting men took away the spear of a man who spear was told to us to be exactly described as Goliath's was,
Right.
with the shaft being like a weaver's beam, same kind of spear. But a regular guy took it away from him and wielded it against him successfully. So again, you don't necessarily have to be very tall to use battle implements that would seem unusually heavy to us or cumbersome.
Right.
Yeah.
Then I'm trying to remember everything you mentioned. So Aga Bashan, for instance. Okay, Aga Bashan.
Right.
And incidentally, Goliath was a Repha. He was an Anakim Repha. He was a Philistine Anakim Repha. So the location from which he came, Philistine, and then the subgroup Anakim, and then the main group Rephaim. So again, nothing to do with Nephilim. King Aga Bashan, of course, we know was a Rephaim king. And one of the issues with him, we have no physical description of him whatsoever, period, none. So when people talk about his height, and they do all the time, they have to really admit, I'm just speculating. It might be sound speculation, but it is speculation because we're never told his height, period. We're told of the height of his, and you rightly said there's scholarly debate about whether it should be bed or coffin or sarcophagus.
Yeah.
And this is when, to me, I'm a big believer in starting at a simplistic, mundane, common sense level. And I generally do that because if not, I find it really hard to understand things. So I have to break them down. So if it's a bed, we know that archaeologists have found beds with the same sort of dimensions and ratio wise. And they were not beds that were meant to be slept on. They were actually ritual objects upon which alleged gods and supposed goddesses mated. Okay, so it wasn't something he was sleeping on. And then again, if he was, even then, look, I'm not an ancient sovereign. I don't have those kind of luxuries that other people might have, like a ridiculously large bed for whatever reason. But still, I think it's pretty sound that we can say it seems to have been a ritual bed. And then also, if it was a coffin or sarcophagus, and recently in Egypt, they found a very large coffin. And when they opened it up, it contained 3 bodies, just regular sized skeletons. But just goes to show, just because the coffin was big doesn't mean the inhabitant, the person buried in it was big. It could have just meant that he was buried along with, who knows, his servants, his wives, who knows what those crazy pagans were doing, right? So those are kind of almost arguments from silence, but I think it's the common sense level stuff that we really should consider that's readily accessible and evidenced before we start making up things like, well, we know he was 13 feet tall. My initial reaction would be, so what if he was? Because I'm not even denying people that were incredibly tall existed. My reaction would be, good for them. I hope they enjoyed it. What do I care? It's like they're not an issue for me. I just want to make sure that when we're reaching conclusions, we're compiling as much evidence, textual or extra textual or from wherever, to reach those conclusions, not just because, hey, you know, I have an entire ministry based on talking about Nephilim and quote unquote giants. And so I need to have something to say. I need to have something to do today. And so that's why I would think about these issues that carefully. And so, for instance, I'll throw in another one for you. The Ammonites, they were as high as the cedars, right? Okay, now, when you're told that their height is as the height of cedars, should we really conclude that what is being implied is that we should conduct a mathematical-based ratio comparison so that if you measure the height of a cedar, that's what the prophet was telling you, that now you know the height of the Ammonites. Okay, let's pause that for a second, because he goes on to say their strength is like the strength of oaks. Now, what I've never read is anybody, even the most wild neo-theo sci-fi pop researcher, claiming, we should calculate the strength of an oak versus the strength of a person to figure out how strong they were. And is it a dry oak, by the way, that's dead, or is it a green one that's still alive? Nobody bothers with that, because that part of the statement isn't convenient. The convenient one is we want to talk about giants. So we're going to claim that the first statement is implying a ratio-based calculation, but the second one isn't, because it's just not useful to us. That's honestly how I think about these things. Is, to me, we're being told, look, these guys are big and strong. Yeah, that I can understand.
Right.
I don't have any problem with that.
And mighty warriors. And mighty warriors. That's a big thing too.
Ken, if someone wants to read, and you've written a lot, they can go to your website at truefreethinker.com. You have a link where they can get to your books there. But I've also listened. My favorite way of reading your books that I've been is to go to Amazon, and many of them are available simply if you have a Kindle Unlimited account.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. Phil went with me yesterday. We go to Best Buy. I bought an Amazon Oasis, a Kindle Oasis. And the reason I bought a Kindle Oasis was so I could start downloading some of your stuff, buying some of your stuff, putting it on.
There you go.
I'm honored. I'm absolutely honored. And yes,
it's worth your time with the Amazon Unlimited, or Kindle Unlimited.
Yes, and I do release a lot of my books for free on. They're all on Kindle, but some of them are actually free. Right. And yeah, for any one thing I've stated, I've built considerable arguments for them in my books. Obviously, anything I've just kind of jumped, if it seems like I'm jumping to a conclusion, I definitely have more detailed arguments in my books about this stuff.
Right. And we're going to be following those because we love your thought process, brother. And I'm very thankful that we came up on you, and to be able to have you on our show today is just a privilege. And we thank you for that.
Yes, I've been honored myself, and it's been a pleasure meeting you, and I appreciate your audience already ahead of time.
Yeah. Okay.
Because if this is the level of interaction you have, that's level-headed, biblical, and tackles issues like this in a reasonable manner, then I think that's a very worthwhile thing doing, and I know that the audience will appreciate that.
Yeah. We appreciate you saying that. We try to avoid extremes unless the Bible calls for it. So.
The amazing thing is we serve an extreme God, so there you go.
But Ken, thank you again on behalf of David.
Thank you in turn.
You've been listening to Justified Radio, where life meets the Bible. You can find us on the web at justifiedradio.org, where you can submit questions, subscribe to our podcast, and find links to our social media. That's justifiedradio.org. Until next time, thanks for listening.